Hey everyone, and welcome to Evindale. So I wanted to throw up a quick little video regarding the races of Evindale, and in the future we're probably going to have a lot more about the races of Evindale, probably even a video that is dedicated to each of the races of Evindale. But in the meantime, I wanted to give you guys something, and I know some friends had wanted to see something like this. So if you are interested in learning about the races of Evindale, then this is the place to be just for now. If you go up to evindaleRPG.com, I actually had to think about my own URL. You'll be able to go to setting and then click on that in order to go down to races. Hey, Mira. Hi, Jessica. And you can actually join me on this. And why I had this up? Why is it not up on my system here? Hold on. Click there. Okay, cool. First off, can you guys hear me? I'm assuming that the audio and everything else is totally cool. Let me go to races and pick this up. All right. So the first thing that you may notice about Evindale is there's not just one of the standard non-human races. Of the humanoid races, elves and dwarves and halflings, there's actually several different types. And in order to really understand how the races came about, or what they are, a little bit of back history of how the world came about might be in order. So let's go way back in time, all the way to the first age of Evindale, and let us talk about the goddess Sithlia. Now, the physical realm, and this means all the known physical universe, the universe as we understand it in ours, about the same size, same number of galaxies, etc., somewhere on the order of quadrillions or whatever. All of physical reality belongs to the Adrahar, known as Sithlia. Now, the Adrahar are a class of the primordial gods known as the Tirsar that have developed such a distinct purpose as a possibility, I suppose, that they kind of became sentient unto their own. Prior to that, the gods, the Tirsar, aren't really sentient at all. If anything, they represent all a possibility. And while the physical world did exist, at least in concept, for a brief flash of time, and that deity became known as Dranathes, that one also was not tempered by stability, and therefore physical reality came in and out of existence immediately. Well, sometime later, you define it, I'll put it to you this way, it's somewhere on the order of billions of years, another Adrahar had been created. This one was tempered by stability and was known as Sithlia, according to some scholars of Evindale. Well, when Sithlia first started to create Evindale, there were no living creatures as you and I understand it. I mean, for real, no insects, plants, or anything like that really existed. Plants were the first ones that she did create, but even then, the physical worlds were really nothing more than molten rock and a whole bunch of other stuff like that, really stardust. So, as planets begin to coalesce and volcanoes came into seas and everything met and the primordial ooze came about, well, you can kind of see that Evindale, or rather all of the physical worlds in this setting, were created typically according to our own Big Bang Theory or what have you. Skip ahead some time, and you start noticing that there's air and fire and water and other things like that. Well, in truth, in this world setting, there are 8 elements. And most of them are known, at least to the scholars, but they are sun and moon, air and earth, fire and water, and then void and spirit. And she started playing around. Now, mind you, Sithlia prior to this time is really just an androgynous creature, but physical nonetheless, just like you or me. Well, Sithlia began going around and noticing that there were no living creatures, and she's kind of bored at this point. So she decided to imbue some of the elements with life. And this is where the elementals had come from, the fire elementals and the water elementals, air, etc. There are even in this particular setting spirit elementals and void elementals, as well as moon and sun. It's just a little FYI, there is one sun, but there are 2 moons. So how that figures into it, well, that's a totally different video. Well, as time passed, she got kind of bored of these rather single-minded elementals, and she ended up touching one of them and forcing an evolution into something new. that something became known as the Fae. So from the elements, the elementals were born. From the elementals, the Fae were born, and they became much more complex and yet still incredibly single-minded. They all had a purpose. Of air, it was manipulation. Of fire, it was rebirth and destruction. And mind you, all throughout this, it may seem a little bit disjointed, but there is no death. Life only existed. So as trees and plants and everything else began to grow, there was a non-stop phase. They fed off of divine energy for their fuel, and there was no death. So the whole cycle of life, where your body, my body, etc., they go back into the earth and release its nutrients, not the case in Evindale, at least at this stage, during what we call the first age of Evindale. Well, time passed. Cynthia had begun to realize that the Fae were rather mercurial, all over the place, and while she herself had a little bit of chaos within her, she was the one who really instituted the laws of physics as this setting understands it. And she decided that she wanted something more. And from that, from the Fae, she touched them. Their evolution came about rather quickly. And from that, the elves were born. Now, we're not just talking your typical high elf or what have you of Tolkien design or D&D design or even a Pathfinder's design, but instead there were different kinds of elves. Of the elves themselves, you have the Adriel. These were the wood elf, closely aligned to the element of earth. The Adriel were considered to be the first ones. They have a slightly feral appearance. They tend to be a little bit shorter. They concentrate more on strength and dexterity, but they lack the intelligence that some of the other elves would have, making them less inclined to be the wizardly types, more inclined to be more the ranger types. Again, having been so tightly attuned to the earth. However, out in the deserts of the world, she decided to create something else, and from this became the Miradil. And the Miradil itself became the sand elves, as other races would end up calling them. The term Mirad itself is a little bit lost in terms of definition as far as the scholars go, and etymologically, they're not even too sure where it came from. But nonetheless, they were called the Miradil, the sand elves. The sand elves concentrate more on constitution and wisdom, but they're not exactly the most charismatic of people. They tend to stay in and amongst themselves. They're not known for their diplomacy in a rather harsh manner. This was also right around a time, for stories unrelated to this and rather outside of the scope of this, this was around a time when evil and good as philosophy started to really come about. And it became known, or the Miradil have a very, very, very strong tradition, and today it's never been broken, that no Miradil can ever be evil. So that should tell you something there. There were other elves that had come about during this time, cross between the elements of fire, which is really where the Miradil come in, and the elements of earth. Other elves, and she began to experiment, began to pop up. And some of these elves began to go into the mountain ranges and into the seas and other stuff like that. One of these elves became known as the Slindaril, and the Slindaril are known as the Ash Elves because of their appearance. Whereas the Adriel have a more feral appearance, hairier. They do tend to grow beards and facial hair. They have body hair akin to what a hirsute human may have. Their eyes have a slightly amber feral glow to them. The Adriel are also known for the slightly smaller pointed ears as compared to what we may normally think, but the Adriel also have slight canine fangs in both uppers and lowers. The Miradil have a slightly more polished look, not as animalistic, not as feral, but their skin has a slight metallic sheen to it. Now, some historians in Evindale say that this was also around the time that the last of the primordial dragons was still around. This was after the time of the dragons. Some say, and this is conflicting information here, so if you decide to use the World of Evindale as your own campaign setting, you as the GM or DM get to decide what it is that you want to do, or maybe you as a player or an avid fan of Evindale, you can decide when the dragons actually did come about. I have an opinion on it, but I don't think I'll ever write anything in stone. But nonetheless, The dragons themselves, adhering to the old tabletop role-playing convention of dragons, how you have the chromatic dragons, the blues, the whites, the blacks, the greens, etc. But you also have the metallic dragons. There is some thought that the metallic sheen of the meta deal comes from some of the metallic dragons, and because they can never be evil, the meta deal, that is a further that kind of further pushes the theory that the meta deal were actually a cross between, or at least somewhere in their past, that they have some dragon blood to them. Certainly, as sorcerers, they are not particularly well known. So the concept of draconic bloodlines for sorcerers, because they're low charisma or lower charisma, they're not really known for that. So maybe the meta deal in your campaign would have a bias against sorcerers who of dragon bloodline. Either way, we leave that up to you. But now we move on over to the Slenderiel, who were more closely affiliated with the element of moon or moons. Now the Slenderiel are called the Ash Elves because primarily the color of their skin. To the newcomer, the Slenderiel would seem to be somewhat monochrome. They have black hair, sometimes breaking the monochrome, almost akin to a raven's wing iridescence or opalescence of a bluish or greenish hue to it, depending upon where you look. But their skin color ranges from that slightly gray-white that you'll find in ash all the way to a charcoal. And like a charcoal gray. They never go fully white. They never go fully black or anything like that. They tend to stay just in that monochromatic spectrum. Now, there are two eye colors when it comes to the Slenderiel, and they have their own theories as to why this is. The eye colors tend to be the colors of gems, the blue like sapphires or rubies or what have you, or they can go metallic as well. There's a bunch of people out there, some of the scholars, particularly in the capital city of Avar, where the Distinel, the Cortex Distinel, is the largest library in all of Evindale. This thing is massive. Some of the Gore-Tex revenants there say that the Slenderiel have a hierarchical system, and it is those with the old metallic eyes that hail from an ancient noble lineage, while those that have more gem-colored eyes are the more recent lineages that have come about. The Slenderiel are not as strong as some of the other elves. They're also much shorter. Using imperial measurement, they come in at around 5'9" on average for the males and the females. Yeah, actually, all of the races here, we don't really separate between male and female in terms of height or weight or anything like that. If you want to do that in your campaign, by all means, that's totally up to you. The Slenderiel, not as strong. So they do receive a -1 on strength to character creation, but they are particularly dexterous. So they get a +2 on dexterity. They are also very intelligent. And so they get a +2 on intelligence, which is rather fascinating or rather fitting, considering some of the lore concerning the Slenderiel, that they actually have some of the old magics, some of the old original magics of Evindale as a course of study within their kingdom, the kingdom of the Slenderiel. They are also they're not well integrated in with the other communities and societies in the world. So they also receive a -1 on charisma, but that is most likely because of their harsh manner. They tend to be a little bit on the dour side. And if you watch the YouTube series, you'll see Hallian Reese. He's a Slenderiel. He's always dour. And so behind the scenes, we joke that he's the token edgelord. And you'll see why. He plays a Slenderiel perfectly. Moving on, we have the Therinil. Now, the Therinil are what they call the Farsight Elves. The Therinil, if you watch the YouTube series, episodes 1, 2, and I believe 3, we had a player in there, Lisa, wonderful player. She joined us for a short amount of time. The character had very wide eyes, and hence the Farsight eyes. They get bonuses to perception, mainly because of their wisdom. They have a lot of common sense, so they do get +2 to wisdom. They're a little bit frailer than some of the others, so a -1 to constitution. They get a -1 to charisma, but they also get a +2 to dexterity. The Farsight, while the Farsight elves would be found really everywhere, you're going to primarily find them in the country of Sta-Abri, which is a more tribal society, where to have a Therinil scout in your tribe is considered an absolute honor. And the Therinil are well paid for their services. That is, if they're not already a part of a tribe. Most of the others, including the Adr-il and one I haven't yet spoken about, the Sadr-il, they come from the elven homeland of Delaran, which is out to the west, just south of Iveria or Ivari. The Slender-il tend to now inhabit the mountains, but when we get into dwarves, we're going to start talking about what really happened to the Slender-il. And this leads us to, of course, the last of them, the Sadr-il. They're known as the Bright Elves. In this case, we're really talking about intelligence. They are also the frailest of them all. They have a -2 constitution, but a +4 to intelligence. And it is the Wazati, or the Council of Delaran, the Grand Wazati of Delaran, that is composed primarily of the Sadrath delegates from all the various regions within Delaran. However, just to the east of Delaran, there's a country by the name of Dra-Anan. Now, Dra-Anan used to be known as Liarani, or the Fields of Green, and was actually a part of Delaran at some point. Many of the Sadrath ended up in Liarani, but then something occurred somewhere in time, and that's a whole story. It is, I believe, it's up on the website, the story, and I'll get into this at some other point in another video. That Liarani was destroyed, and all of those that died, their fats and muscles and sinews and everything like that, absorbed into the land and actually corrupted it due to the nature of all of the destruction, and that gave birth to Dra-Anan as a country. The Sadrath that were there are said to have been corrupted by that, and their bloodlines have continued since. So there is some theory that the Sadrath from Dra-Anan and the Sadrath from Delaran are two different races, if you will, or two different kinds. I guess you can call them sub-races, but whatever. And then there are others that see no difference between them. And certainly there are stories of a Sadrath from Dra-Anan that was taken as a child and raised in Delaran and was absolutely fine, and vice versa, those that were taken as slaves into Dra-Anan. So that covers the elves. Oh, excuse me. The Sadrath tend to be very, very tall. If you were to take a standard elf and then spaghettify them, draw them out to about 6.5 to about 7 feet tall, they tend to have exceptionally pale skin. Where the Slender-il on the lighter spectrum stop right around that light gray of ash, and hence again their name. It seems that the Sadrath pick up from there, where the Slender are considered the shortest of all the elves. The Sadrath are considered the tallest. So people wonder if there's a correlation between these two races. No one really knows. The Sadrath do look like that they were taken and stretched out. So their faces are much slimmer. Their bodies are slimmer. Their frames are lithe. And their intelligence is absolutely horrifying, making them some of the best wizards around. We're going to move on to some of the other races now. We have the cat folk, which are known as the Firaf. They come from a grouping of islands, which is far to the southwest. And up until recent, we're looking at around age 4 of Evindale. And I know that nowhere else are the ages really discussed, but age 1 is when Sylvia created the races, kind of, sort of. Age 2 was known as Chaos and God Kings by some. This is a horrific time. The 3rd age was entering into some exploration by some of the races, and the 4th age is typically your high fantasy. The 3rd is a little bit on the low fantasy. And then the 5th enters into a whole new phase. The 6th is more modern times, and the 7th age of Evindale is actually science fiction. So, but that's for a whole other discussion. The cat folk really started making themselves known to the rest of the world. It's not like they weren't known. I mean, magic does exist. Divination spells exist. You can fly around. You can do all sorts of things. And the cat folk live on a grouping of islands. So their presence was always known, but they were somewhat of an isolationist community. And the Firaf eventually went out. They became a boat building civilization, and they journeyed out towards the end of the 4th age. The Firaf have a +2 to their dexterity, a -2 to their wisdom. They're rather capricious. They'll just go out there, pretty much screw danger. They do have common sense, just not as their sense is just not as common as others, I guess. But they are rather light. +2 to charisma. They make fantastic diplomats. and they can be rather frightening. They are based is pretty much off of the Catfolk, off of the Pathfinder series. Now, system. You have also dwarves. Now, the dwarves came about at a much later time. The dwarves came about due to, some say, a further experimentation from Scythia during the First Age. In fact, it is said that the dwarves come from the elves. The dwarves will vehemently disagree with this. But unlike other fantasy settings, the dwarves and the elves do not necessarily have any kind of a built-in dislike of each other. They don't really have that. In fact, the only ones that are really close to the dwarven homeland, which is in a range of mountains known as the Spine, which is far out to the east, are the Miradil, the sand elves, whose territory of the deserts of the world tend to border those mountains. Now, there are two kinds of dwarves. You have your spine wardens, which is your typical D&D type of dwarf. They are your +2 con, +2 wisdom, -2 to charisma. Everything else is all pretty much typical with them. They are stubborn, and this kind of goes into the elven word for them. I actually have to look this up really quick. Hold on. The elven word for stubborn happens to be the same word for dwarf. So if you want to build in some kind of where is it? I have to pull up. There's a languages section up on EvindaleRPG.com. Yeah, Aegon. Aegon is the word for dwarf and stubborn. So cute little thing there. The other dwarves are the ones that do not necessarily reside within the spine, but instead are seen as the more charismatic, meaning that they have normal charisma as opposed to the -2 that spine wardens receive. The hillslider dwarves instead are a little bit taller. They tend to dwell on the surface of the spine itself or of the mountains. Just in general, that's where hillsiders go, and hence their name, hillsiders. They actually travel. They're the ones who invented skiing and brought that technology down to the rest of the nations. Their trade posts include plenty of wood carved items and other things like that. Whereas the spine wardens tend to concentrate more on rocks and the smelting thereof in order to create the metals. The hillsiders go more with wood-based products as well as sciences. They are really the foremost. If there's any one particular community, not necessarily just restricted to race, that is concentrating more on the sciences and technology, would be the hillsiders. The hillsiders also receive +2 to dexterity, +2 to con, -2 to wisdom. They don't have that same kind of common sense or have the ability to perceive as well as the spine wardens do in some other races, but nonetheless, they are very good in other aspects of life. You also have gnomes. Now, gnomes for a long time just didn't exist in Evindale. Well, a lot of players really wanted to see the gnomes, so a story was created. As far as I'm concerned, gnomes are aliens. It's that simple. They don't come from this planet. They come from somewhere else, and they are horrific little I'm joking. The gnomes are awesome. However, while they are your typical D&D type of race in terms of bonuses, meaning a -2 to strength, +2 to con, +2 to charisma, their origins are not necessarily the same as the other races. There is a story which is being written about the gnomes in particular, so maybe at some point we'll be able to catch up on that. But their automatic languages that they get at character creation, aside from Gnomish, and they also speak Sylvan, and that should tell you kind of their origins. Goblins are also now a playable race within Evindale, having -2 to strength, +4 to dexterity, and -2 to charisma. The goblins tend to be the slave races, or one of the slave races of Dra-Anan, that horrible community that's just depraved everything. Just a barren wasteland of evil. The goblins have been a slave race in there. Some believe that they were created by the Dranis that live there. Their story has really yet to be known, and certainly there are as many stories as there are goblins to tell it. Aside from the moving on to the next ones, of course, there are half elves and there are half orcs. Orcs are not a playable race within this, typically resigned to NPCs. However, if a DM or GM should wish it, or absolutely bring in orcs, bring in anything else. Lou, yes, absolutely. Goblins do exist. They are a lot of fun. They're not your typical Pathfinder or D&D type. And yeah, sure, they can speak in all sorts of fun languages and stuff like that, which is typically how people portray them. Feel free to experiment with it. They're kind of a new addition to the World of Evindale as far as playable races go. So I'm really looking to get some feedback from players. If you guys are going to play it, I'll leave something down in the comments below. Love to see what it is that you did with your your goblin character. No, Mira, sorry, no orcs yet as a playable race, but half orcs are there, and they are very closely tied. Half orcs. Well, talking about that just for a second. Since we were talking about the evolution of the elves, where they came from, so just as a recap, if you're just joining us, we have the elements were created, the 8 elements, from them the elementals, from them the fae, from them the various elves. Now you may notice that there was a trend going from like the moon with the Sindar, the Sadrat belonged to the sun, and hence the bright elves, the Mirad, the fire, the Faranil, the Farseer elves, they think what came from the element of air, and etc. There are some elves that are missing. Now, the mages and scholars know that there are 8 known elements. Where are the other elves? That's a question for you. But getting back to orcs, it is said that the orcs go back to age 1, which I did during the first age of Evindale, and we start entering into a discussion of primordial dragons. When I say primordial dragons, I'm talking about beasts who can put one foot or another on 2 different continents. These are massive creatures. They were created by Sithlia to just push the terrain in however she saw fit. So in some areas of Evindale, geology just doesn't make any sense. And that might be because it was actually created by one of these primordial dragons. Well, over the course of time, they ended up getting smaller and smaller and smaller until you have your typical fantasy dragons, which are still massive creatures, but, you know, respectively, or relatively speaking, much like on a scale of fractions smaller than the actual primordial dragons. Well, it is believed that the orcs actually were descended from the dragons, at least if you believe the orcs. So when you talk about half orcs, you're talking about potentially having dragon blood within them. Certain scholars believe that. Certain magics have revealed that as well. So maybe half dwarves do exist. We just don't have the stats for them, but chances are it's going to be +2 to any ability score, just like in half elves or half orcs. There's no real reason why they couldn't exist. And as Evindale gets further developed, the half elves should be able to choose a bloodline, which will give them racial traits more akin to their parental, more akin to the influencing parent that is an elf. We'll get into that, but for now, racial traits are your typical +2 to any ability score. I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to play a half dwarf. It's just not yet written. Halflings also have 2 different subraces. The first of it is your typical halfling. Now, while granted, I believe that the original halflings of D&D were based off of Tolkien's hobbits. In this case, the halflings of this world are not necessarily, they don't all live in hills, etc., but they do have these little pockets of communities. And the word halfling itself is actually a pejorative. Halfling, that's what a human calls somebody of that stature. To themselves, they are known as the Iglin. And the Iglin, this is in their native tongue. It means the hill people, and that goes back to their origins, which were these nomadic people who had been driven out during the Second Age from large plains. So there's some stories there where the old Iglin heroes they were horse riders, and they were everywhere. And then they got driven off into the various places, and some of those places were the hills. Now, this goes in line with the second subrace of halflings, which are known as the Tierfolk. It is said that the Tierfolk First off, the tierfolk are absolutely terrifying. Your typical halfling, or in this case, an Igorlin, has a -2 strength, a +2 dexterity, and +2 to charisma if you're following Pathfinder. Well, the tierfolk have a +2 to strength, a +2 to constitution, a -1 to intelligence, and -1 to charisma. The tierfolk are stout. They are a little bit taller. So while a halfling is typically around 3 feet tall or so, a little bit shorter, a little bit taller, a tierfolk tends to be just a little bit taller than that, right around like the 3'2", 3'3" range. And they are said to be the first ones. They have their tierfolk is it's their same name in their native tongue, which is a dialect of halfling. And tierfolk means the people of the gods, as in the Tirsar, which had come back, going back to the beginning of this video. They are said to come directly from the gods themselves. Scholars disagree with this, but whatever. So that's up to you to decide. The tierfolk tend to be today more nomadic, and that kind of fits in with the origin stories of the Igorlin as we know them today. The tierfolk tend to roam the lands, the tundras of Nudrium, coming all the way down into northern Kultrek, down into southern Kultrek, and even the deserts of Malech. And that whole area are the nomadic territories, and they have their own tribal system. They tend to disregard the political boundaries of the existing countries. They're not exactly an oppressed people. They are very well known for their trade. A lot of people like them. A lot of people don't like them. There are evil and good tierfolk, and the evil ones tend to be highwaymen and raiders of trade caravans that come in from other countries to other countries. So it's up to you as to however you want to incorporate them. Now, as far as humans go, okay, so while there's no real story regarding halflings and how they came about, and just like the gnomes are still somewhat of a mystery, there is absolutely a story of how humans came about, and this goes way back. When Scythia had created the elves and they started going around and spreading around here and there, they pretty much stuck to their own pockets of civilization, or their own pockets, pretty much geopolitical borders, and the mountainous regions of such and such became that for the Theranil or the Sindaril or what have you. Well, the Sindaril haven't always been what they were. When they came into the mountainous regions and they were living there both above and below, they were the ones who had discovered mining. They were the ones who had discovered ores and what to do with them, but not yet. Remember, according to the myth, there was absolutely no life, or excuse me, there was no death at this time. The races were everywhere. Everyone was propagating, and no one ate meat because you would have to kill the animal, and the plants themselves couldn't eat those because as soon as you harvest it, you kill it. Well, everything was feeding off of divine energy. And this kind of goes into the creation of the dwarves, Exactly when the dwarves came about is up to some debate. We know that they came about in the First Age, but all of a sudden, these creatures known as the dwarves probably broke off from somewhere. It's up to you to decide where. And they began to inhabit the mountains as well, the homes of the Slindar. So where exactly did the Slindar go? Well, when the dwarves started entering into these tunnels, they had found the Slindar down there, and the Slindar were like, "Excuse me, who the hell are you?" They couldn't get into a war because with war you need to vanquish your enemies somehow. There's no death, so what do you do? So the Slindar were eventually displaced by the dwarves, and all of the Slindar ended up migrating north into what is today known as the Kingdom of the Slindaril, or the Slindari rather. And that's where your animosity between elves and dwarves comes in truth. The Slindaril exist in both above and below. Some have drawn comparisons between them, with them and the Drow of D&D fame, but that is not the case. There is no spider god. There's no particular hierarchy. They do have a governmental form that is very unlike anything else in any other writing that I'm aware of. They have a backstory which is completely original. Again, as far as I know, I mean, nothing's truly original, but the Sindaril are not Drow. And we have to state that up front. There are some similarities, but that's only when you delve into the darker color skins That's it. Even the hair is completely black, etc. So there are some who live in the ground. There are some who live above the ground in the forest, and they're primarily forest dwellers. However, when all of these races are around, all the world is being populated, things are becoming overpopulated. There was some contention amongst all the races, and some of them had sent some delegates to Scythia. Now, Scythia at this time was a mortal in the way that we understand it during the first age. No one's dying, so effectively immortal. And Scythia was very curious about why people were complaining. She created all this. She she didn't understand it. So she finally said, "Yep, you know what? Enough is enough. This is all my plan. My plan is you guys work all this out." Okay, fine. So all the races were kind of mystified. They didn't understand it, and they continued to complain. And Scythia was like, "I've had enough." And she went to one of the Fae who had recently become an elf, touched that one, and imbued that one with all of her creative energy, thus turning that individual into a demigod. That demigod was given a name, Evin, and that is where the world of Evindale comes from, the home of Evan. And there's a reason for that. Evan, or Evin, was sent into the world as a delegate to Scythia, and it was Evin that was supposed to handle all of the complaints from all the other races. Well, remember those Sindar? How they were forced underground by the dwarves, or they were forced into hiding by some of the other elves. They all ended up in their own kingdom. Well, those Slindar who went down into the ground, they did a little bit of mining. Now, prior to this, nothing was made. We're talking a very early period of time for all of these races. Magic was being used, but all magic in this case was divine. Arcane magic did not exist. Everything fed off of divine energy. Everyone worshipped Scythia in their own way simply by existing, by breathing the air. And that entire process, all of that was due to Scythia. People never died, so already you have creatures which are tens of thousands of years old. Well, the Slindar during that time wondered why, if fire, the element of fire, is introduced to a particular rock, a particularly hot fire, in this case like lava or what have you, or nearby, whatever, why it melted. And when it melted, some of it separated into glass, the silicates from the rock, and some of it separated into this other thing. This other thing became ore. And so when Evin was coming out to this delegation of all the races to settle all their various squabbles, the Slindar brought with them something that no one else had ever done. And this was the first mortal-made creation. In this case, it was a crude blade. And in fact, the Slindar name for themselves is not the Slindaril. Il, by the way, that apostrophe I-L, Il means first people, or to the elves, elf. So Miradil, Slindaril, Theranil, all of that is elf at the end. The Slindaril do not call themselves that. Slindar is a pejorative. It means those who wield the coarse blade. When Evin came to that meeting of the delegates of all the races to settle this literal world war that was going on, even though there was no death, even though there was no damage, I mean, people would punch each other, but it did nothing. Or throw rocks at each other and bounce off the head and say, okay, that was kind of fun, but whatever. The Slindar were the ones who said, I wonder what this will do. And so when things got passionate at the meeting, and Evin was as uncaring as Scythia had been, resorting to this whole concept of, nope, this is her plan, this is my plan. Evin even repeated it. This is according to Scythia's plan. This is her plan, that all these things must occur as is. In other words, evolution, what have you. That's when the Slindar said, I wonder what this will do, and stabbed Evin, running his blood, his divine infused blood, into the ground. At that point, across the world, a wave of divine magic went everywhere and infected and corrupted and did horrible, horrible things, because the divine magic of life was now corrupted by death. Evin was not only the first death, Evin was the first murder. And they say that it was the Slindar who had done it, or the Slindar delegate. No one knows exactly who that name is, but that's why the Slindar have the name that they do today. And that's also why they were ostracized and cast cast out by many of the other elves. And if you play the game and you want to play with those, the stereotypes, they tend to be a little bit more edgelordy because they've been picked on their entire existence. The elves believe that they're justified in casting them out of any kind of an elven community. But meanwhile, these squabbles continued. Scythia came and saw what had happened to her consort, Evin, and said, what has happened? And then looked over and saw another god. This one was priorly known as Endings. Well, all a possibility at some point or another in time, in other planes of existence, those of the gods, there was all sorts of change and other things like that, but something had to come about. That was conclusion. Things would rise and they would fall. That is conclusion. And this one was known as endings. The same thing, conclusion, endings. But here in the mortal world, it was known as death. And death stood there, looked straight at Scythia. Scythia's like, who the hell are you? And what happened to, like, she's kicking him, like, get up, dude. Why are your innards bleeding out all over the place? Why is this red stuff all over? And why is the land now soaking in your blood? Why is there so much of it, torrents of it, like oceans of this stuff? Well, what exactly happened next between death and why it split into the two gods known as Feir and Fein? That's for another story. But none of the races were yet sated, except Scythia could no longer address any of the concerns of the mortals. She was a deity of life, and now this was a world that had death in it. War was now possible, and she had to leave, and this was not her choice, for another god had now stepped foot into the mortal realms, death, and she was cast out into what is now known as the Isles of Evin, a place where no living person nor dead can ever set foot. Instead, the souls of the dead only, meaning no dead body can even go there. No physical form can ever go there. Now, that's a whole other topic as to about the Isle of Evin and whether or not you can even step foot on it. You can see the island. You can pass right by it. You can go within 100 feet of the shoreline. Do not let anything physical actually touch the island, and you will find out why. So that's a whole other story. But now Scythia was taken out of the mix. She has no consort. She has no real delegates into the world. So she did one last thing, and that is to create one last race that was comprised of all of the elements, the humans. Humans were created, and they, in this setting, are known as Clane. Not humans like us, because we are not comprised of elements, the 8 elements, sun and moon and earth and air and fire and water, spirit and void. Instead, they are comprised exceptionally magical beings. Clane can exist anywhere. All of the other races are kind of bound to an element somewhere, and that's why you have these pockets of civilizations. In the forest, you have your elves. In the mountains, you have your dwarves, and in the higher peaks or in the higher altitudes, you have the Theranil. You have in the deserts with fire, you have sand and the sand elves, the Miradil, etc. Well, the humans can exist anywhere, and now that death was around, and humans did not have a very long lifespan as compared to some of the other races, we began to see humans populate rather quickly everywhere. And many of the other races did not like these newcomers, these Clane, as they ended up calling them. So what happened with them? Well, it appears that before the Clane, who were comprised of all 8 elements, came about, there were some experiments on Scythia. We don't know exactly when, what age. We think it was still in the first age before it would come about right at the beginning of the second age, is when humans came about. Evin's death, the creation of humans, marks the beginning of the second age. Duh, I only created this stuff. It's not like I really know it. So apparently there were some experiments that Scythia had taken, and she tried imbuing. She went back to the elementals. Remember that the elves had originally come from, and she tried imbuing the elements with the same kind of life that she had seen existing elsewhere in Evindale. Well, one of them had been born of fire, and these became known as the Efreet. They are like Clane, but they have a bloodline that goes back to the element of fire. You have the Corvadan. The Corvadan are humans that are bound to the element of spirit. You have the Oriad, which with some of these we do know. The Corvidon is original to this world, but the Oread and the Efreet, they come from other compendiums, other systems. The Oread, they come from Earth, and just like the Oread, +2 to strength, +2 to wisdom, -2 to charisma. The Efreet, +2 to dex, +2 to charisma, -2 to wisdom. The Corvidon have -2 to constitution, +2 to intelligence, and +2 to wisdom. And the Corvidon, their automatic language is Celestial, which speaks volumes about their origins of what Sithli had done, along with the element of spirit, and imbued at some point the elements of spirit with this mortal life, thus creating the Corvidon. There are others out there. They've not yet been made known. So the real question is, where are they? What of the, are there ones of water? Are there ones of air? We don't know. We'll have to see. Moving on into other races, playable races, there's the Revenant. Now, the Revenant is not your typical Revenant as we think. They are undead, but they're not exactly the same. Remember I mentioned the Isle of Evan and how no living person could ever step there. Well, according to one theory put out there by a pretty heavy-duty scholar out of that Codex Distinel in the capital of Avar in Ivry, he believes that the Revenants are actually those souls whose purpose in this world are not yet finished. And they were sent by Sithlia back out into the world. And they became the only undead, which is not evil. Well, in a manner of speaking. So the Revenants are a playable race. They get -2 to constitution, +2 to intelligence, +2 to charisma. They heal like undead, and they cannot be resurrected. If they die, that's it. Boom, they're done. They have a driving force which wants them to continue to finish that goal in life, which could be an entire adventure from levels 1 through 20 or what have you and above. This is up to between you and your GM or DM. There are Tengu in this world. They come from Lochthel, which is a range of mountains over by the Spine. They tend to live in the higher altitudes. They are the anthropomorphic birds, as we understand them to be. There are Tieflings as well, claimed that apparently were introduced at some point or another in their heritage to a demon or a devil. There's plenty of story there. There are the Undine. That's right. There are the Undine that claim that had mixed with the water in the past. There's one race here which is actually not a playable race in Evindale, only because it is wickedly overpowered. It is the native slave race to Dra Anan, with a -4 to intelligence, a -4 to wisdom, a -2 to charisma. They are not exactly mindless, but these poor wretches with the WRATCH are so piteous, but they were genetically bred by the Dranese to be some of the most powerful warriors out there. And that explains their +6 to strength and +4 to constitution. These creatures are some of the worst ones out there. Each and every single one unique in its own mouth shape. Some are incredibly tall, some are incredibly short. Their average height is around the 5'9" mark, and that is mainly because they tend to be hunched over. Their spine is curved in wicked places. Sometimes they walk where their ankles force their feet to be on a 90-degree angle, and they walk on the side of their foot. Their mobility can be very fast, sometimes very slow. It's really up to the GM to tell a really good story when they go to present a wretch. And in the YouTube series that I run, the players there or the characters have come across a couple of wretch and how they were used by the Sadrath of Dra Anan, and it's to me it's absolutely horrific. You don't really want to come across them. So that's pretty much it when it comes down to the races of Evindale. If you decide to use this setting in your own game, by all means, feel free to contact me. I'll be more than happy to help you and provide you with some actual canon for backgrounds of the creation of new races, where they might fit in, and other stuff like that. If you have any questions or something like that, please feel free to comment here, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. In the meantime, I have to go back. I'm now going to prepare for our Tuesday taping of our YouTube series. If you're interested in viewing that, go to YouTube, then just search for Evindale, Evindale. We're coming up on episode 16. I'm really looking forward to it. The players just discovered that there might be something much more going on in their world. Other than that, thank you so much, guys who have stuck around. I hope you got something out of this. We'll be covering religion in the next one, the true origin stories of Evindale, how death separated, et cetera, et cetera. So look forward to it. And in the meantime, I turn the world over to you. Go have fun with Evindale, guys. Bye-bye.